So, good evening. My name is Paul van Sale. I'm one of the co-founders and the Chief Creative Officer at the Conduit. And we have been broadcasting and Zooming from all of our respective homes in varying degrees of self-isolation for the last couple of days. And we are delighted that you've all started joining and are logging in. The purpose of tonight's discussion stems from a relationship that we've had for some time now with the Financial Times, with Gillian Tett, and with the Moral Money column. And it really stems from our shared interest in trying to examine the role of capital, of corporations, and of finance in trying to achieve a more just and a more equitable and a more sustainable world, and to try and interrogate those subjects with rigor and in a thoughtful way, and to try and encourage all of us playing our part in this regard. And at this moment in history, I think there's never been a greater need for institutions and individuals with access to power and money to try and use those, broadly speaking, in the common good. And before Corona, I think we would be having a sort of conversation which said one of the single most important things that you can be doing at this moment is taking a look at your investments, not being passive about them, and trying to make sure that they are allocated towards a set of goals, particularly on climate, but not only on climate, that will ensure maximum sustainability. And there are people in this room who are far more expert than I on this topic. It is my job to welcome all of you here and to thank you so much for joining, and to hand over to Gillian Tett, who requires little or no introduction, very senior figure in the Financial Times and the kind of brains and soul behind the Moral Money column and initiative. And thank you very much for steering the ship from now on out.
Well, thank you, Paul. And I should start by saying that I am truly delighted to be taking part in this event and this new innovative experiment in how to respond digitally and show resilience and innovation. I'm going to say a couple of words briefly about why the FT has got interested in these issues, and then introduce a panel and hear from them too. The background is that I've been working at the FT covering finance now for about 20 years. And about 2 years ago, I noticed that I was getting a lot of press releases from different companies and financial groups about ESG, environmental, social governance issues. And since I'm trained to be a cynical journalist, my first response was, to be honest, to chuck them in the bin and say, well, this is an awful lot of, companies trying to paint themselves well and engage in various forms of greenwashing. I sometimes joke that ESG should stand for eye roll, sneer and groan, as far as many journalists are concerned. And then I suddenly stopped and said, well, hang on, if this flood of press releases and actions are coming out, there must be something going on. And I sat down and spent some time listening to people in business and finance, the people who the FT talks to normally every day, and realized that there really was quite a striking paradigm shift underway. Inside corporations, the C-suite, there's a growing recognition that there's more to a company than just serving shareholders. They need a wider purpose. They need to think about stakeholders. Inside the financial markets, there's a recognition that they need to do more than just one, in addition to taxpayers' funds and philanthropy. And that's forcing a rethink in terms of the environmental, social, and governance issues. And it's really driven by a mixture of motives. There's some people, some investors, who actively want to change the world and want to engage with impact investing. Some just want to do no harm to the world, and some want to do no harm to themselves and realize that ESG is no longer just about activism. It's increasingly something that's about risk management, in the sense that it makes good financial and business sense. So we launched the newsletter Moral Money, which I hope that some of you will have seen. You can sign up for it. It's actually free at the moment if you sign up. It comes out twice a week, and a web page at the FT to try and track this new world and this changing zeitgeist and paradigm. We did that 7-8 months ago. Didn't actually know quite how it would go at all when we started. As I say, most journalists tend to think ESG is eye roll, sneer and groan, and we thought that maybe this is just a kind of short-term fashion. But I'm delighted to say that since we started, it's turned into one of the fastest growing new products the FT has ever launched, with levels of engagement which are frankly off the charts. Not only do we have an open rate, i.e. how many people actually open the newsletter, of around 40%, but we have a huge amount of forwarding of the newsletter going on as people share it, which we love. We'd like it even better if they signed up, but we like people to read it. And all of our surveys of the readers show that it's exciting a real passion amongst the audience. And I mention that because on the one hand, it's nice for us at the FT, but more importantly, it shows that there is a zeitgeist shift underway as people rethink things that used to seem very obvious about business and finance being there to make money and not care about anything else. There's a real recognition that you need to take a wider lens. Now, you might say, well, that's all well and good, and maybe that was just a bit of a luxury of a bull market, and this boomed because frankly the last few years have seen some pretty good times in finance. And you might also say, well, given we're now coping with a panic and a pandemic and markets crashing and governments scrambling to boost growth again, maybe it's all going to disappear. I think actually in some ways the opposite is going to happen, because at the moment certainly people are distracted and scrambling for survival, but the horrific events of the last few weeks are showing three crucial things. One, it's not just about money and profits. In the last few years of a boom, often shareholders have thought that it really was just about making good returns. That's been the dominant paradigm of much of the financial industry and business. But by golly, if there was ever a moment to have rediscovered the point that actually business and finance is about people, and we need to take a holistic vision of life, it's right now. Secondly, the coronavirus pandemic has shown that scientists cannot be ignored or should not be ignored. And that message doesn't just apply to the medical sciences, which we're relearning right now with tragic consequences. It also applies to issues like the environment. And we've learned that actually we live in a very connected global planet where contagion is an ever-present threat, and where, in a sense, the weakest link in a chain matters enormously and matters with environmental issues. So I suspect that environmental issues are going to become more, not less important for many investors, voters, and policymakers. And last but not least, we're also learning in a very brutal way that you can't ignore the other aspects of that ESG component, which is about social and equality, social inclusion, issues like that. Because we really do live in a planet where the weakest link in the chain can break and create devastating consequences. And for far too long, many businesses, many of the elites have been able to ignore parts of the world that were inconvenient or out of sight, out of mind. And the current pandemic has challenged those ideas. How that will cause businesses to respond, I don't know. We at the FT are scrambling to cover the change in attitudes, and we've been absolutely stunned by the degree to which companies are responding to the pandemic in a way that was not the case 10 years ago. In fact, I was on the phone this morning with the very senior business leader who said that back in 2008, when that crisis happened, you didn't get companies and financiers queuing up to see how they could respond, or queuing up with the awareness that if they ignore their employees and stakeholders, they're likely to pay in the future once we've got past this survival moment. But the question we're here to talk about tonight is what it means for ordinary savers and pension people, particularly in the UK, but not just in the UK. Because, of course, there is an extraordinary power of private sector capital out there today, which is not being fully harnessed to support these goals. So we're going to hear a bit first from Richard Curtis, who is somebody who needs absolutely no introduction himself, who has been championing this fascinating initiative, Make Your Money Matter, or Make My Money Matter. As many of you know, he's a film writer and director. He's done many films that we love: Four Weddings and a Funeral, Notting Hill, Bridget Jones' Diary. I dare say some of you are watching it right now as you're stuck at home, looking for a laugh. But he's also been a key activist in recent years, championing initially the Millennial Development Goals, now the Sustainable Development Goals, and involved in things like Red Nose Day. So he's going to tell us a bit about his new initiative, Make Your Money Matter, or Make My Money Matter, and how that dovetails with these wider aims. Then we're going to hear from John Ditchfield, who's been working in responsible finance for over 20 years, initially in microfinance, and now he's basically involved in, and now he's been an owner for one of the UK's first business to offer ethical investing, and he can talk about the practical implications of what's going on. And then we're going to hear from Catherine Howarth, who is the Chief Executive of Share Action, which coordinates civil society activism to promote responsible investing across Europe. So, three great speakers, three great perspectives, but I'm going to start with hearing, or going to start by passing the microphone, or not the microphone, the virtual cyber microphone, over to Richard to tell us why he's launching his new campaign now.
Oh, hello. So, well, look, thank you very much indeed. This is it's lovely to be here, or to be here and there. Thank you very much, Paul. Thanks very much to the Conduit and everyone who's online, and to Gillian. And obviously, we're all, in a very new situation at the moment, working remotely, and in my case, part of a new sort of domestic world order which isn't working remotely. My son Spike's in charge of garbage, and he's already gone on strike. I'm in charge of washing up. I'm judged to be doing a fairly poor job of it. But I'd like to just give in a way, it's a journeyman's version of how someone like me, who's quite a normal person with regard to money, has suddenly become so obsessed by this idea. And so I would like to feel that I'm not only representing the Make My Money Matter campaign in a way, but also a normal person who's come to this revelation about how important the money that you have, particularly in pensions, can be. So let me give you a bit of context, because I think this is in a way a journey that many of us have been on. So my sort of journey of involvement in public issues, I didn't do anything for anyone until I was, I think, 32. And it began in 1985 when I went to Ethiopia in the wake of the famine there and saw, terrible suffering, things that no human should ever suffer. And since then, I have been obsessed by the simultaneity of human suffering, the awareness that as we sit here today, there's a young girl being forced into child marriage, or a mother choosing whether to spend her money on food or on medicine, or, a family deciding that tonight they've got to flee their homes and become refugees. And of course, today there'll be millions dealing with coronavirus with absolutely minimal health systems in place to help them. So, as it were, at that age and at that point, my reaction was to be part of a group who set up Comic Relief and Red Nose Day. So that was a fundraising proposition. That seemed to be the way that you could most help change the world. That would, as it were, be, I would call, my CSR phase. Now, my next step was that I got involved in the politics of things. So this was after a conversation I remember with Bob Geldof, when he said that he'd made more money in a 30-minute tea break with President Mitterrand than in the whole of Live Aid and Band-Aid, because Mitterrand said they would nudge up their foreign aid by a percentage point of a percentage point. And that was more money than you could make through fundraising. So that made me part of the Make Poverty History campaign and the Live Aid concert. So that was when my perspective shifted to, as it were, campaigning for governments to do more. And that was in the era of the MDGs, when we were all trusting that, if we went to 0.7% in aid, that would solve the world's biggest problems. And so that was a fight for the MDGs, and therefore I became obsessed by the SDGs because I wanted them to be more successful than the MDGs. I'm very interested in sequels. Anyone who's seen Bridget Jones 2 or Mr. Bean's Holiday will know how guilty I've been of bad ones. So we worked to make the SDGs famous. We worked on the branding. We made films to explain them on television. We worked out concise names for them. And they, you know, until this crisis, I think had done, in a way, unexpectedly well, and particularly in the business community, where they really seem to have caught fire as a way of organizing business in order to think about, you know, responsibility and sustainability in a more complicated way. And those of you who haven't engaged with them, I would suggest you do, because they are a kind of living plan to make us the first generation to end extreme poverty, you know, the most determined generation to fight inequality, and the last generation that needs to battle climate change. And so that was my sort of commitment to spreading the news of political potential. And this pension campaign is a really interesting fourth part of that journey. Fundraising, I still totally believe in. Political pressure, I believe in. The importance of the SDGs, I believe in. But I suddenly have felt, and it's going to be so interesting to see what happens now, but I suddenly felt that the flavor of the times is shifting, and we'll have to see what happens after the crisis. But I'm very interested in the example of 1945, when, for all their admiration, the British public voted out Churchill and voted for the Labour Party, which brought in the NHS, upon which we now so desperately depend. So the big question is to see whether or not we will all build back better, and whether business and government have the capacity for that. But what I saw, only 3 weeks ago, I was at a meeting with Mark Carney and 400 financial experts, and all of them were describing that the pursuit of sustainability might be the greatest business opportunity since the Industrial Revolution. So indeed, in their minds, it was becoming a thought that business might move, as it were, from corporate social responsibility, moving into, as it were, responsible social corporations. And this possibility aligns with the big thing that I've been feeling, the new flavor of how to change the world, which is people in the street saying, what can I actually do in my life to help a world on fire? What can I do, not with giving money from time to time, not with only protesting to governments, but you suddenly see people, particularly our kind of brilliant young activist generation, asking that question and finding a lot of gripping answers in the food they eat, in the way they travel, in the clothes they wear. And then the huge revelation to me was in the power of our own money. The fact that, as it were, where our money is invested in banks and insurance, and especially pensions, is hugely powerful. UK pensions are worth, I think, 2.2 trillion on their own. And this money is of a dimension that, if invested in things that could change the world, would make an extraordinary difference, more than, as it were, 10,000 red nose days. And this awareness that people have this extra power is what led us to think that we would launch this campaign, Make My Money Matter, which particularly would focus in on pensions to start with. And we were going to start in April with a gutsy stunt and have a lot of partners we were working on, because most people don't even realize that their pensions are invested at all. And when they do, it's going to be a big revelation of new power that they have, and a big new decision that people can make in their lives. Now, when it's going to happen now, I don't know. Our second focus was around the Glasgow COP, but no one's now sure what that event will be. But these pensions and our money and our influence over them is the biggest pot of money that the public owns. And there's a kind of profound relevance to it, because a pension is there to ensure a good life after retirement. But what's the point of a safe house that you're living in if the street itself is on fire or flooded or locked down? And then people will begin to realize, will people want to invest in fossil fuels and cigarettes and armaments and gambling when they could be investing in renewable energy and healthcare facilities and sustainable housing and sustainable agriculture? Do you think that people will stop their kids smoking and yet support British American tobacco, make 100 daily choices for the environment, and then fund ExxonMobil? I think people are going to realize the moment that, as it were, that door is opened, what a piece of Finnish research we've looked at, which says that actually changing where your money is invested is 27 times more effective in reducing your carbon footprint than going vegan, taking fewer flights, using less water. So we're in a way talking about a new concept of your financial footprint. And when DFID did some research, they found that 70% of the British public, when I sort of asked about it, wanted their investments to be ethical and sustainable. So the big sort of residual question is it going to risk my return? In other words, you don't want to interfere with your pension's ability to pay out. But it certainly was becoming the case, we'll have to see what happens now, that there was a consensus growing that sustainable pensions were not riskier than the default ones. And actually the risk in business was starting to lie in businesses that didn't have a long-term sustainable view, cleaner energy, in businesses with dirty supply chains and dirty secrets that were becoming a really popular interest with journalists, and in businesses that were having trouble, you know, recruiting the best staff and getting customers because they're not thought to be good and sustainable businesses. So that's where this idea of a pension with purpose, a pension with purpose and profit, pension to be proud of being pension positive, really does feel to me as though it could be a big issue when we try to build back better. So just to quickly go into the details of the campaign, I would say that we've been absolutely startled by the number of partners, and you're about to hear from a couple of them already, but you know, all around us, from Share Action to the Impact Investing Institute, from Prince Charles's Accountability for Sustainability Group, to the World Wildlife Fund, to the Green Finance Institute, to, you know, discussions with the real players, pension funds like Legal & General or Nest, banks like Triodos, corporates like Tesco's and HSBC, the Church of England, government bodies like the Environment Agency, all of them really were and are interested in progress towards this. And so there seem to me like three areas that we can really look at: changing individual savers' minds so that they in fact say, I want to change and I will work to change my pension to be sustainable; recruiting supportive businesses, so actually businesses go back to their staffs and say, where would you like your pension to be? And they're going to find the answer is consistently for sustainability. And then actually talking to industry and government about how to facilitate in terms of legal restrictions and governmental guidelines and trustees' responsibilities and all the evaluation frameworks. So we have thought it through quite seriously. It's not just a bunch of, you know, idealists saying, wouldn't it be great? So as it were, that is my introduction to why I think that the Make My Money Matter and the growth of responsible investing, not only from investors, but from the public demanding it, could be a huge part of the sort of Build Back Better campaign. And, you know, I would just say that there's a very interesting thing my friend Paul Pullman at Unilever has been saying, which to me, which is that the cost of fulfilling each of the Sustainable Development Goals is less than all of them, is less than the cost of not fulfilling any one of them. And we've just seen that with regard to health. All of the Sustainable Development Goals, to fulfill their full promise, is something like 3 trillion a year. And we're going to be paying a lot more than that for failure on health. So I'm hoping that people will be interested in this campaign and will be, you know, interested in thinking about it and talking about it in the future. So that's my main point. Also, obviously, it's my responsibility to recommend something on TV. I've been enjoying Inside Number 9 and obviously the blazing masterpiece that's Julian Fellowes' Belgravia with Helen.
Thank you. So we get some free viewing tips as well to keep us interested. That's very inspiring. I must say, I like the Build Back Better. I think that BBB tag is about to become probably a new viral slogan to inspire us all. But having laid out the plan or the path of where you're trying to go, you say you've had partners getting very involved and excited about it. So let's hear from a couple of the partners. John, do you want to tell us how you've got involved and why you think this matters?
Okay, so just a bit of background on what I've been doing. So I became interested in responsible investment in the early part of the last decade, in around 2001, with, at the time, a very small investment firm that was focused on what was then branded as ethical investing. So that was primarily around the exclusion of certain activities from investor portfolios. And over the last 15 or so years, I've been seeing this sort of intensification and huge growth of interest in the area, and also a development of something that used to be relatively niche and was focused around avoidance of certain activities, and is now much more encompassing, as we've seen with the introduction of concepts around sustainability, the growth of ESG investing, and as Gillian was explaining in the introduction, how this is becoming so widely adopted by business leaders. So you have both on the the company side of this, but then also the product side and the innovation side within investment houses, a huge amount of interest in ESG and responsible investing. I mean, Richard's introduction was so eloquent, it's difficult to, he covered most of the things I was going to mention. I mean, for example, the Big Society Capital research that you recommended, that you mentioned, which was also supported by DFID, which showed that essentially the population want this. I mean, I was chatting before the call to a chap called Peter Michaelis, who's actually on the sharp end of running responsible or sustainability focused pension schemes. And we were talking about how, isn't it curious that the finance industry is an industry which tends to give people what it wants to sell them. You know, it's not an industry which looks at what the public want and then develops products around that. What we've had for as long as I've been in investment industry, is the majority of product is focused on what the investment industry feels people should own. And actually there's a huge disconnect between that, and there still is. I mean, a market that perhaps Richard didn't mention, which I think is very interesting, is the workplace pensions market. So as people will know, in the last 9 years now, we've had the growth of auto-enrolment in the UK. So just to give a bit of context to this, the UK has an enormous pension savings deficit. Most people get to retirement age with a total pension pot of around £100,000. So most people simply aren't saving enough into pension schemes. So the government moved to create automation, to create defaults, so that everyone who was in employment would have a pension scheme. And this is now being rolled out to the self-employed. But when it did that, the defaults that were actually offered don't reflect the kind of values and concerns that investors typically have. So it's extremely difficult to find a default which will give you no exposure to fossil fuels, or no exposure to weapons or cluster munitions or other areas of concern. So to say a bit about what my company does now, so I have a research business called Impact Lens, and over the last 5 months we've been running research with the UK's major workplace pension providers, where we're actually analysing, well, what do you hold in your investment fund? What is your process around ESG? What is your process around responsible investment? And the reality is the industry still doesn't get the message on this. The industry is still committed to not answering those types of questions largely. So, you know, I think definitely there's this enormous increase in interest from the general public. I was watching Richard's the video on the Make My Money Matter website, and it was fascinating seeing those responses from people as they learn, well, hang on, this isn't the kind of thing I want in my pension scheme. It's not, I don't want to retire and benefit from cigarette companies or companies which have destroyed the environment. But the problem is, you can take people to that point where they recognize there's a problem, but it's what comes next. Where's the product or the service that will then move them away from that sort of scheme into something which has a more of a sustainability-led approach, or a strong ESG approach, or actually fits their needs? Because the industry, even now, isn't delivering that sort of thing at scale, is my own view. So there we are.
Well, thank you, John. That's fascinating. And I must say that simply showing people where their money's going is a very powerful first step, because most people don't know. and they actually don't know about the options that are out there to actually change that. I mean, I think, you know, once you show people where their food comes from or what's inside their food, they often change habits. I suspect the same thing is true of money as well. But Catherine, tell us how you are involved in this.
Sure. Well, first of all, I just hope that I'm going to be hearable, because I'm seeing all sorts of signs that my line is unstable. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yay.
Yep, it sounds good. Yeah.
When I turned myself off, there was a huge amount of frantic activity with my husband being dragged into the room. But we're cool. So I just, what is so exciting about this campaign, this prospect, is that at least in the UK and increasingly around the rest of the world, pensions are for everyone. Since the UK went for pensions automatic enrolment, everyone with a job, lots of people currently maybe in a very unstable situation in terms of their employment right now, thanks to coronavirus, but everyone has a pension scheme of some sort or another, which means all of us, whether we kind of get it or not, are every month out of a paycheck, if we're not in the self-employed group, which is most of us, are paying into purchase assets like equities in companies and bonds and maybe a bit of property and so on. And that just gives millions of very ordinary people, including people on very, very humble pay, a stake in the system of influencing how companies operate. And of course, most of the time, those people's voices are not heard, and the pensions industry isn't really listening. But the incredible prospect of the Make My Money Matter campaign is to start to channel that energy. And I think just to take this issue right now, which is in everybody's mind and filling everyone's newsfeed, which is this terrifying pandemic, what loads of people are interested in is how are companies responding to that? How are they treating workers, not just in their direct employment, but in their global supply chains? What are the steps they're taking? Are they shoring up other stakeholders, or are they really looking after workers? These are all questions that our pension funds can have a real influence on. And so what we do at Share Action is try to keep an eye on the pension system and particularly specific pension funds and asset managers that look after the assets. We do things like ranking the largest asset managers in the world. We just produced a big ranking of the 75 biggest fund managers globally, assessing them on their responsible investment performance. How are they thinking about these environmental and social issues? How much do they really take the trouble to vote at companies' AGMs and use that power? And how much are they listening to their members, the pension fund members? How much are they really accountable to the underlying base? So that's what we're involved in at Share Action. We're very excited about Make My Money Matter. We're very pleased to be part of the coalition and feeding in the experience we have over a number of years. The industry has been moving, as you said, Gillian, in your introduction, in a really positive way, but real acceleration is needed. So there's a lot of chatter out there about, you know, aligning portfolios with the Paris Climate Agreement and you know, really thinking about investing in renewable energy and so on. But the reality is that it's quite a cautious industry, the pensions industry, and it needs a kick up the bum, to be rude about it. It really doesn't, and people will give it that. So what we need is to kind of release the incredible passion that people feel about whether it's sustainable food or climate change or public health, and make it a kind of honestly like a sort of electricity current that then sort of sends a shockwave through the pension system, and then in turn through to companies, and builds the kind of world that we all want to retire into.
That's fascinating. I see that John wants to come in with a comment. Do you have any more thoughts about how to kick the pension industry up the bum? What the butt, as they say in New York. I'm sitting in New York right now, so. Well,
I wouldn't propose to do that right now, but the point I wanted to make actually was something Richard mentioned around performance. I mean, the concern historically in my part of the investment market has always been, well, it's fine having all these very positive intentions and it all sounds very good, but what about money? Can we actually deliver a strong financial return so that people have enough money to retire on? And the good news is, and I can say this as someone who's established pension funds for the likes of WWF UK, of Greenpeace. I have to name check Vivienne Westwood as one of the fashion brands that's been a leader here and been prepared to take a stand on this. Their schemes have delivered excellent financial performance. So I've compared the financial returns over 8 years now between those schemes and mainstream pension schemes. And actually, because of their focus on industries which are much more progressive, focus on renewables, on energy efficiency, they're actually showing better performance. So when someone goes to their employer, so an employee perhaps listening to this thinking, well, does my company offer a responsible pension scheme? They might also ask, well, is it a good scheme? Is it going to deliver the right kind of investment performance over the next 20 to 25 years if 8% of the scheme is invested in fossil fuels and industries which are essentially, well, one would hope, reducing as a component of the economy?
That's fascinating. I see that Catherine wants to say something, and also Paul. But before I do, just quickly, I mean, we recently sat down and tracked last year on Moral Money, with the Moral Money team, how the ESG funds and sustainability funds had tracked compared to their non-sustainable rivals, if you like. And certainly over the last year or two, they've have, if not performed equally, many of them actually outperformed. It's very striking. And I think we're going to have in tomorrow's edition of Moral Money, the newsletter that goes out tomorrow morning, more data on what's happened in the last few weeks during this crisis, which is really quite startling. Now, you can't judge anything from just a few weeks, but certainly it would be hard to argue at the moment on the data that we've seen and that we're going to be publishing tomorrow that sustainability funds are performing worse than their counterparts. But I can see that Catherine's got another hand up. Is that, Catherine, do you want to say something? And then Paul?
Yeah.
Catherine's got an electronic hand up and Paul's resorted to old-fashioned waving. So.
I want to respond to this point about financial returns and sustainable investing, because it is absolutely true that sustainability funds are starting to look very, very positive compared to ordinary bog standard investment funds that track, for example, a big index like the FTSE 100. And that's great, and obviously very, very helpful. My own pension scheme is Nest, which is a huge pension scheme for 9 million people in the UK, and the ethical fund is outperforming the default fund, which is great. But I think we can almost lose the wood for the trees here, because actually what ESG is about is protecting against the kind of horrendous systemic risks that we've just seen played out over the last month. And, if we do not take a really quite aggressive approach to decarbonising the economy, and potentially even handle the fact that in a very short-term perspective, that may produce more, it may be a little bit costly, then coming down the line are the kind of really severe impacts and costs that we've just seen play out in the economy over the last month. So I actually think we need a really bold perspective. It's not enough to say, yay, although it's good, sustainability funds are outperforming a teeny bit compared to kind of classic trackers and ordinary funds, because we need a more ambitious approach, which is actually very aggressive towards decarbonising and really using the power of our pension funds to shift the economy in quite dramatic ways to protect against the much bigger type losses that we've just witnessed.
Right, well, both Paul and Richard want to come in here. Paul, do you want to go first? Because I think you waved at me first, and then Richard.
Yeah, I mean, a statement and then a question, which I think will tee up Richard quite well. But one is just about corporate behavior in the last couple of years, and perhaps what the bailouts in the wake of the coronavirus are going to do. But I read a really startling report in the last couple of days about the behavior of particularly airlines and what they did with their surplus cash. And often what they did was buy stocks back. And big share buyback schemes inflate your share price. And if executives are rewarded in short time horizons based on share performance, then what companies do is take their cash, buy back stock, deplete a prudent cash reserve, and reward a small group of people at the very top. And now we are faced with the very real prospect of public money bailing out airlines to the tune of hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars. And I think when we think about Build Back Better, one of the things that we're going to have to do is think about incentives, executive behavior, time horizons, the ways in which we judge performance in an entirely different way. And I think pension funds, or those acting on behalf of pensioners, have got to start insisting in a much more assertive way that these sorts of perverse incentives are changed as a matter of policy and law if you are to get a single penny of pensioner money passed on either directly to a company or to an intermediary. And then my sort of question, because I think one of the reasons I'm very excited with someone like Richard being at the helm of this campaign is I think we have to make these rather arcane matters easy, tangible, accessible. We have to give ordinary people a sense of agency and power and fun. You have to be able to take people who are disaggregated small investors and make them feel as though collectively they can stand up against a set of interests which are perhaps behaving irresponsibly. So I'd love to kind of hear how it is that we're going to make this more popular, more accessible, more fun, more tangible, give people more routes to action, because I think that's going to be part of the trick as well.
Okay, Richard, how do you make your pension sound truly thrilling?
Wow. Actually, I was going to say something. I think there are lots of very interesting and gripping facts here, it being a new area. I mean, what we were talking then about sort of risk, I was very struck by this fact that someone said to me that if temperature reaches 3.5 degrees, the insurance industry as a whole ceases to exist. That's quite an interesting thought, that business resists change and then gets itself into a position where it becomes uninsurable. And we're seeing an example of something like that now. So I think there is drama in it. And in fact, Paul, we've got quite a fun campaign plan that I won't reveal, but it's all to do with...
go on. You've only got 160 of your closest friends.
You know, one of our ideas was to just send to all the most powerful influencers on the planet 2 boxes, one of which reveals what you get for your money if you invest in a default pension, and one of which shows the things that you'll be helping if you don't. You know, that idea that in the one box you open, you'll get some bullets, some cigarettes, and, you know, a bottle of alcohol. And in the other one, you actually get all the benefits of a renewable, benign and good business, because there's this whole thing online of people unwrapping things. So that, and we're thinking of, well, there are all sorts of other things that we're doing, but I do think that it is a rich communication area. For me, my breakthrough moment was a TED talk by this woman called Bronwyn King, and I suggest that you all watch it, because she is an oncologist, a cancer doctor, lung cancer doctor, spends 15 years of her life saving people's lives, has her first meeting in a cafe with her accountant, who says, you know, your pension's doing okay. She says, where is my pension? And the guy said, I'll look back, I'll see. And it turned out that 3 of the top 5 companies she'd been investing in were tobacco companies. So she'd actually been responsible for the deaths of more people from cancer than she'd saved. And that horrible revelation of the sort of contradiction in our lives has now been matched by a massive and fun pension thing called My Future Super in Australia, which is the most thriving pension campaign. And that, you know, gives the sense, because they call it superannuation fund in Australia. And suddenly my hope is that the communication burden will be taken off us and onto the pension companies, who are actually going to say, we're the best. We're the ones who are actually selling you brilliant things. We're not going to do that old stuff if you're a young person who wants to change the world. So I hope that we'll be able to open it up, and then in a funny way, it will actually start to move fast. And I've been finding this so exciting. I've actually had 3 or 4 meals with friends of mine where I mention it and they contact their pension before the dessert arrives. And actually said, I'm definitely going to do this, for God's sake. And everyone in my office has been doing it. And one person was told by them it was going to cost them £5,000 to change. And then he complained and they said, oh, look, we'll let you off. And someone else did it in 5 minutes and someone else has got stuck. But I'm hoping that we will really be able to, you know, make noise and get it into the dialogue in the same way that like flying has. Flying, which is a much smaller issue than the issue of pension investment.
Well, there's a lot packed into that. We have a lot of questions coming from the audience. If you want to add in one more, do please type in. But before we go to questions, let me quickly turn it to John, who would like to comment on that. And then I'm going to start throwing some of the questions at our panelists.
I was just going to make a quick point following on from Richard there. I think also, and sorry to be sounding a note of caution here, I think one of the challenges is that the investment industry will roll out ESG light products of, how can I, putting it politely, sometimes fairly dubious value. So I've been looking just in the last couple of days at the solution offered by one of the UK's largest pension providers that provide schemes for millions of people in the UK. And essentially what they did was introduce what they call an ESG tilt into their main scheme. Now, by tilt, they mean that they change the 10% allocation within the portfolio so that it represents companies with high ESG scores. Now, what they will then do is market that as a sustainable or responsible investment solution. And I think the challenge there is ensuring that people are confident here, adequately educated and understand and can make some of those distinctions. And perhaps that's also where the regulator needs to be in part involved, because there's a huge problem of the labeling of these solutions. But there we are.
I mean, I like to believe they'll get caught. I think that, you know, it's increasingly been becoming, as you see with Facebook and their ads and Volkswagen and their pollution issues, it's a great story when people are trying to con the public. And if they become interested in this, they won't. The FT will make sure they're caught, won't they, Julie?
Well, we actually have, as part of our Moral Money newsletter and website, a section called Grit in the Oyster, where we call out companies that are essentially engaged in greenwashing, woke washing, whatever you like. And we've also got, in response to the coronavirus panic right now, we're running a series called Saints and Sinners, which is proving very popular, although I think we should actually have a saintly yield curve, which looks at how companies are responding on that yield curve. And, you know, I do think that oversight and hard questioning and, you know, the usual journalism, if not cynicism and skepticism, is absolutely needed to put the sector onto a sustainable footing and a long-term credible footing as well. But anyway, we've got a lot of questions, and you'll be glad to know apparently you can vote on the questions about which is the most popular amongst the audience. So you'll be glad to know, Richard, the most popular is a question from someone called Emma Freud asking, can you ask Richard what time he wants supper tonight? So there you go. But having asked that, and I'm sure you can signal to her about that, let's start with one question, which is a very good question from Seb McKinley. He's asking, should we be promoting the idea that investors sell out of businesses that are unsustainable, or should they essentially stay invested and take an activist approach to call for change in how those businesses are managed? Because, of course, if you only invest in businesses that are already sustainable, in some ways you're letting the others off the hook. Anyone want to comment on that?
I'm very happy to. I think it's absolutely the right question to ask, because there is an enormous influence that pension funds and large investors can have on companies that are poor performers. And there's incredible good evidence that when investors step up, I've been involved at the moment in a shareholder resolution at Barclays Bank. Barclays is the biggest financer of fossil fuels of any bank in Europe and the 6th biggest financer of fossil fuels in the world. And what this project needed was investors that held shares in Barclays and could really have an influence. And it's been incredible to see the pressure that's been applied on Barclays. And we will have news very, very shortly on how Barclays is responding. But it's been really good proof to me that it's very, very important that investors that care about these issues are holding on to companies that have a problematic record, because that's how we really change the world. And I was, you know, from a financial point of view, to return to the point made earlier, that some of these high ESG performing companies outperforming financially, you might be better off from a financial point of view holding a set of companies that are just really virtuous on all these things. But if you want to have an impact on the world and change things for the better, you need to be holding companies that have some way to move and really using your voice. And that is what we try and promote and encourage. Now, the problem is there's a lot of holding on to companies and they're not using your voice that goes on in the pensions industry. And in fact, there's a lot of talk about how we're really engaging, we're really using our voice, but actually it's all very feeble, and actually don't ever vote against the directors of those companies, for example. So there's a long way to go in making that engagement a bit muscular. But I'm a real fan of the power of the shareholder to move companies forward, and then to actually celebrate and support and give real, you know, kudos to corporate management that do move in response to that pressure.
Now that's fascinating, because in a sense what you're saying is if you want to be tracking your pension managers and seeing whether they're actually upholding sustainable goals, don't just look at don't just look at what they're actually invested in at the moment, look at how they're actually engaging with the companies they're invested in as well, which of course is much harder to measure, but very, very important. Any of you want to answer that or comment on that? Because if not, we have a long list of other questions.
I was just going to say very quickly, Gillian, that I collect data on this kind of activity. So I do research on sustainability funds, the extent to which they engage. And I've been recently looking at the UK's largest mainstream workplace pension providers on this issue. And it's a terrible show, really. There's virtually no engagement, especially in the workplace pensions market. Of the 7 providers that I looked at, only one had a credible response on this topic. Sorry, right. I'm the voice of doom. I've got this dark background here, and I'm also the voice of doom. But no, but that's the reality. We did a research piece. We looked at 7 providers, especially in workplace pensions, and I'm sure Catherine would agree here that there's just very little activity in this area around really consistent, methodical engagement, which is focused on driving positive change within companies.
John, right. It is all going to change when Make My Money Matter launches upon the world.
Fantastic. Well, listen, we've got another question which is probably aimed at me, so I'll briefly address it, which is who should define the moral benchmark we evaluate as being good versus bad investment? I mean, briefly, as I think I've just said earlier, this is our Moral Money newsletter. The name was chosen because it's catchy and because it's not meant to sound religious or pious in any way, shape or form, or suggest that we have the answer at the FT about what is moral. On the contrary, all we're trying to capture is a shift in zeitgeist, which is that people are starting to look at the consequences of how they use their money and invest their money. We're really moving towards a world of consequence-based investment. All money or investing, if you like, is impact investing. The question is whether it has a good impact or a bad impact, and whether people think about it. And so in that sense, you know, what we're moving towards is a world of more moral money or moral investing, which I think dovetails well with Make My Money Matter campaign. But there we go. Anyway, the next question I was going to turn to was this. If investment, from David Nussbaum, if investment returns on someone's pension will be higher and less volatile if invested sustainably, then it's economically attractive to invest in that way. Isn't the issue what to do if the returns might be lower and or more volatile? And that very much picks up on Catherine's point that we can't just look at the returns as a reason to get involved. But how concerned are any of you about the prospect that we might suddenly see dramatically volatile returns or bad returns from sustainable investing?
So I've been tracking the performance of a number of leading sustainability solutions through the recent market downturn. And actually, because of the high quality bias. So what do I mean by that? I mean that typically sustainability funds are buying high quality companies that have a bias towards industrial services, you might say. So they're in areas like energy efficiency, they're in water, sanitation, often they have exposure to healthcare. So actually they've performed very well through the recent downturn. I have data on, obviously it's been negative returns, but it's certainly been less volatile than some the major global indices. And one of the big factors there was that the recent downturn in markets, obviously prompted by the spread of the coronavirus, was also accompanied by a huge sell-off in oil, or a collapse actually in the oil price, which was prompted by a dispute between Saudi Arabia and Russia. Now, sustainability funds had almost no exposure to fossil fuels and oil producers, so weren't captured by that risk factor as well. So I would say that over the long term there has been some additional volatility, but certainly in recent times there's no evidence that people are suffering a more erratic or volatile return as a result of having a bias towards a sustainable, responsible investment approach.
Yeah, could I just say that I think, obviously I don't really know how companies work, but I do know that the journey for consumers will be towards companies that they consider sustainable and moral. They're the ones that are thriving. And people aren't going to get any less curious. My daughter's already got an app where she can actually check the sustainability record of any clothing company that she's on the high street and thinks that she might want to purchase from. So that is a really interesting direction of travel. And the idea that it's consumers and staff. Unilever did this really interesting thing where they did an ad for the same job. And in one case, they stressed the perks and the money. And in the others, they stressed Unilever's sustainability record and moral purpose. And they got most of the responses, hugely more responses to the ones where people thought, I'm working for a worthwhile company. So common sense would say that if the consumers and the quality of staff, you see the horror with which people have greeted the behavior of Wetherspoons and Sports Direct over the last few days. So just as a person who's thinking about consumers, staff and reputation, you would have thought it would be safer to invest in companies that have sustainability and aren't going to be caught out by dirty supply lines.
I can see that Paul's waving his hand.
So Gillian, probably about 10 years ago, launched a sustainable fashion company. And at that time, I remember including in our investment deck the idea that consumers were now not prepared to pay more for sustainable products, but would be prepared to pay about the same if they were of comparable quality, and that it would give you, if goods were priced the same, people would buy a green or a sustainable product over one that wasn't. About a month ago or 2 months ago, we had a launch at the Conduit of a report done by Julius Baer on kind of just looking at consumer attitudes globally. And it was striking to me how there's been a complete data-driven sea change, which completely confirms what Richard just said. Consumers are shunning unsustainable products, not buying them, and particularly young people are moving away from them in droves. And people are in fact indicating for the first time in many different sectors that they're willing to pay slightly more for products that have better environmental, social, or other qualities. And so I think that is going to become more and more the norm. And we have a co-investment platform at the Conduit called Conduit Connect. And there is not a consumer-driven company that is being launched or financed that comes across our desk that doesn't try and gain additional customers because of, in these instances, an authentic commitment to sustainability. And it's almost the price of doing business. It's table stakes right now. And so I think this will lead to a completely different investment paradigm far quicker than we previously thought.
Great. We're starting to run out of time, but I can see that Catherine wants to make a comment, and then I have one last set of questions to wrap together.
Well, just to link this stuff up, those consumers are also pension savers, and this consciousness that has been building amongst people when they do their shopping is just so ready to surf this wave, if you like, in the investment sphere. And I think that when people start thinking, where can I have most impact? Well, you can have impact as a shopper, absolutely, but you can potentially have astonishing influence if you're having a link through to the very significant shareholders that own large companies that you feel concerned about. So I think this is just so integrated, really, and it's a very, very promising moment.
Right. Well, we have a couple of questions. Again, we have masses of questions, which sadly I won't be able to get to all of them. But again, it shows a level of engagement and interest. And not least a question from somebody saying, will Richard do the washing up tonight after supper? Okay, we know the answer to that one. If you are, here's one of the questions. If you are at a company and you want to lobby for change and the company wants to change, what does it practically do next? And we also have a related question, which is, how does this dovetail with fiduciary duty? And how does this dovetail or not dovetail with what auditors are doing at the moment and should be doing? Anyone want to give a sort of 3-point guide as to what you do if you've been utterly convinced by Richard and want to go back and tell your bosses that they've got everything wrong in their companies and need to use this time while they're homeworking to change? Richard.
Well, I'd just like to say that's a kind of good final question because it highlights the complexity of these issues, the complexity of changing, the complexity of auditing, the complexity of the rules, about which Catherine and John would know more, and I'm sure we'll say more. What I would say is that I think it's a really interesting idea that you would say, if you're worried about this, find 20 other people in your firm and go to the chief financial officer and say, ask us what we want. Because the answer will be that 70% of people in the firm do want their pension to be sustainable and ethical. And then it becomes a responsibility, and by asking the question, a sort of commitment, because they will never not ask that question, to going through what are all the hoops that you would have to go to change things. But then I'm sure that John and Catherine are thinking about how the government and companies and pension funds and their trustees can make those hoops less onerous, and the transparency about where things are going happen swifter, because that's another whole issue. But I think that generally within companies, I think that's what we're going to be saying to people. Find a group of people, and instead of going to them and saying, can we have 2 more parking spaces, say, can we change the pension to make it an ethical one?
Right. John, do you want to jump in there?
Okay, so yeah, I mean, that's an excellent approach, really. I mean, that is the reality of it, that individuals in a company, and in most cases, when they look for a sustainability or responsible investment option within the company's existing scheme, it won't be there. And at that point, they need to say to some of their work colleagues, is this something you also care about? And then start a conversation with whoever is responsible for pensions. Now, part of the problem here is that within a lot of employers, especially companies with, say, fewer than 1,000 staff, you'll find that there aren't clear lines of communication here. It's actually quite a difficult thing to try and achieve. But with some persistence, with identifying who that person is, perhaps at board level, who takes responsibility for this area, it can be done. And I think the point I would want to make is it's not actually very difficult to change. Actually, especially in workplace pensions, making a transfer from one existing scheme into a new scheme it's not a difficult thing. We did it for, sorry to reference again, but they did a great job here. Vivian Westwood were with a major pension scheme. They were very unhappy at the quality of the sustainability offering there. We did the switch. It took us 2 weeks to put that together. It's not a difficult thing. But you need momentum. You need support.
Catherine.
So there was this question about this thing called fiduciary duty. I just want to pick that up. Fiduciary duty simply means that your pension fund has an obligation to act in your best interests. Now, historically, that has been interpreted as undertaking an investment strategy that would maximize profits, because that would make you more money and that was in your best interest. But in a world in which we're heading for catastrophic runaway climate change, it's not really in our best interests to be in pension funds that are aligned with 3 to 4 degrees of global warming. We need our pension funds to be acting in our best interests by investing in a way that takes us on a different trajectory for, a 1.5 degree or at worst 2 degrees of global warming. So it's a brilliant concept, this idea of fiduciary duty, but it needs to totally pivot to taking account of the fact that my best interest now is living in a world where we've managed systemic risks like climate change and pandemics in a very different way, and that's built in and designed into pension fund investment strategies. So
right.
I would like to just endorse what's been said, that probably the number one thing to do is to make sure that your employer knows you're interested and is shopping around and using their kind of muscle as a big buyer on behalf of everyone in your workplace or in your company or in your organization to get the most sustainable pension fund available on the market.
That's fascinating. Just very quickly, I mean, Richard, I had one other very quick question to ask you, which someone has asked, which I think is very relevant as a final question or final comment, is, to get this message out, it needs to be, as one questioner says, sexy. That happened in the fashion industry. It's happened in other areas of campaigning where people have taken causes and made them sexy and exciting. Do you have any sort of tame celebrities who are going to be championing this for you? Can we look forward to Julia Roberts or anyone like that suddenly standing up and talking about this?
That's going to be interesting. It's a complicated one because people are always worried about talking about their money, and particularly people often say with celebrities, they've got the money to solve these problems themselves. Why do they ask other people? I'm not ruling that out. And what we'll certainly do is use entertainment and the very best sort of media marketing companies that we can. So it'll be interesting to see whether or not when I first start to propose it to people, but I would hope, we might start a kind of cascade of people saying, I've done it, I've changed. And it didn't take long. We've done it. People in my firm have done it. We're trying to get a lot of other people, when the campaign launches, to say that they've done it. And then it'll be interesting to see whether well-known people say that it's something that they've done. And I think it might happen.
Fascinating. Well, listen, I found it a fascinating conversation, doubly fascinating, but do this by Zoom, and very inspiring and very exciting. So I just want to say thank you to all of you for taking part. And I know that Paul wants to say a couple of words just to try and wrap up.
I really want to thank everybody. Thank you, Gillian, for wonderful chairing. And just to say that, it is 6 days since by government order, the Conduit's physical location that so many of you have been in was ordered to close. And since then, we have pivoted into a digital life. We offer over 2 hours of this programming every single day. We do a COVID briefing with public health officials. We have taken our signature programming and are offering it in a digital format. We do a special session on Behind the Noise, where we try and look behind the COVID insanity and try and discern what kind of a society we're going to live in when this is all over, and what kind of society we can help shape. And so thank you all very much. We are being forced to self-isolate and socially distance, and it is an extraordinary thing to be able to gather. At some point during today's talk, there were over 188 people all listening in on this Zoom call, and many thousands more will watch it when we broadcast it. And the power of community and the power of collective action and the power of solidarity is going to get us through this. It's also the force that has changed human history and bent the moral arc of the universe towards justice, and we will do all of that together. So thank you for tuning in.
Thank you.
Thank you.